but we're going to get started for the second half of the day. And without further ado, I'd like to bring on Stani from Aave to talk about all things DeFi. Please give me a big round of applause. Stani, this is a big week for you. So I want to jump right in. Well, what does DeFi 2.0 mean to you? And why are we talking about DeFi 2.0?
Yeah, I think DeFi 2.0 for me means there's basically a new environment in decentralized finance to actually innovate and build. So obviously we started building DeFi already back in 2017 when the term DeFi wasn't coined yet. And over the years, obviously there has been some sort of kind of like a headwind for decentralized finance and also blockchain and crypto in general from like regulatory standpoint. So I think now we're entering and have been actually in a new type of an environment where actually on-chain innovation is something that is seen very positive, and there's an optimistic atmosphere. And I think this is the reason why we see a lot of new exciting announcements coming even during this week, and we see a lot of new innovation in the DeFi space. So for me, the DeFi 2.0 actually means that it's the kind of like a new era of being a DeFi developer and being able to innovate and also kind of like recreate ideas that don't necessarily exist at the moment in decentralized finance. So it's basically kind of a new beginning to enter into the space as a developer.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, the other part that I think is interesting here is that you are working on Aave V4. It's been 3 years since the last version of Aave. So I'd love to know what's new and unique about V4.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that happened over the years is that Aave grew to become the biggest DeFi protocol at the moment, and there is roughly 43 billion worth of assets deposited into the protocol, providing yield against different types of collaterals, and there's different types of markets and risk profiles. And over time, what we realized is that one of the benefits of Aave and why it's growing so significantly is that it's a one entry point, a protocol essentially. So, or let's say a product. And what it essentially means is that when all the users have one kind of market to enter, the liquidity stacks into one particular location, and you have less of issues of liquidity fragmentation. So what we realized as well is that in the future there's going to be a lot of more native crypto assets, but down the line there's going to be a lot of also traditional assets coming on chain as RWAs. And what we want to achieve is that we want to enable innovation in a way where in Aave you can create different kinds of risk profiles without deploying new markets and segregating liquidity. So we created a completely new architecture based on liquidity hubs and liquidity spokes. And what it means is that a liquidity hub is where all the assets are actually stored, and liquidity spokes are just borrow configurations or borrow strategies. And this means that a spoke might have these types of parameters of what kind of assets could be listed, what's the loan to value of these assets are, so how much you can borrow against Ethereum or borrow against other types of assets, and then they're connected into the liquidity hub. And liquidity hub is what gives the spoke the credit line. So think about it as a kind of like having a central bank and commercial bank. So central bank creates some sort of risk profiling or capital allocation profiling, and the commercial banks create these borrowing strategies. And what we really wanted to achieve is not only creating different types of risk profiling, but enabling developers to actually innovate and access to the Aave's liquidity. Because we're meeting a lot of DeFi developers, and there's probably a few of them in the house today. And a common issue for a lot of DeFi developers and founders is that they build really interesting and amazing products, but there's a really challenging and lack of liquidity. And typically it's solved by creating incentives or renting liquidity from other kind of like providers for additional payments. And that type of a model doesn't scale. But if you innovate something in Aave V4 by creating a spoke with some customization for your product, and if it's viable, it can get access to directly to the liquidity from the liquidity hub, and that really seeds the innovation.
Did you kind of take inspiration from something when you kind of agreed on this model, or how did this kind of naturally come to evolve?
Well, mainly the inspiration came from when you look at the existing Aave market. So whenever there is a new market, you have to somehow seed that liquidity. And typically you have this chicken and egg problem. So what you see in DeFi quite frequently is that a lot of projects they use, for example, rewards or some sort of liquidity kind of provisioning or renting services. And what we wanted to achieve is that how do we actually ensure that you have one central point of liquidity, and these markets could create it at any point, at any configurations, and seed it directly. So the kind of awarding comes a bit more of the way the airliners work. So for example, or any type of hub and spoke system where you actually want to have concentration, but also like a segregation at the same time. I think the central bank, commercial bank is one kind of like an analogy to think about it.
No, that's got it. Well, that's kind of one thing you already talked about, but I'm curious if you can give any other examples of spokes here, and like what are kind of ways that we're already seeing people do hacky things around this in DeFi. Like, can they replace this with a spoke model? Are there more ways to intuitively think about this?
Yeah, quite common example is just thinking about the risk side. So, for example, a very popular strategy is to supply into Aave Ethena's as USDE, to use it as a collateral to borrow stables and leverage this position to maximize yield. And currently that asset is listed in the main Aave market, and whenever there is a high interest rate, it drives the borrowing cost for all the users quite high. But with the Aave V4 hub and spoke model, what actually happens is that we can create a separate liquidity hub and separate spoke, particularly tailored to this strategy, meaning that the core liquidity hub can actually have a lower yield, but also lower risk profile, while the Ethena liquidity hub and spoke can have a higher cost of capital, but also higher yield. And these spokes can be connected to any liquidity hub. So for example, even in the lower riskier liquidity hub can actually allocate part of the capital into the spoke if they want to have an enhanced yield. So that's like one example from like risk standpoint. The other example is you can use, for example, AMM LP shares as a collateral by creating a spoke for that, or you can create a spoke with, for example, safe or a custodian where the actual asset is stored in the custodian or in Gnosis safe while you're borrowing funds from the protocol. And this is an example requirement or kind of an appetite that the institutional users are looking from like a compliance perspective.
Exactly, because then you can be on a third-party custodian and still actually take benefits of all of this. That's actually a super cool idea. How does governance change at all in V4?
Yes and no, in the sense that all these contracts can be governed by the Aave DAO, but at the same time, anyone can create liquidity hubs and spokes. So it allows permissionless innovation. And the way I think about it is that you could bootstrap an idea, particularly from a combination of these both primitives by innovating. And if that idea actually gets traction, you can request access from the main liquidity hub that can be governed by the Aave DAO as an example. So there's different ways to think about it. Yeah.
how, so this is, I guess, if that's the case, so the thing I'm curious about is, does that mean now you have to create a space for the spokes to govern themselves? Or would that still be managed by the entire set of contracts for Aave DAO? Or do you, because of the different risk profiles, you kind of create different competing opinions on how some risk should be managed with how each spoke is set up?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that there's two categories. There's one kind of like a Aave curated, sorry, curated category of liquidity hubs that users can supply liquidity, and certain spokes are attached to that. But then there's completely permissionless liquidity hubs and spokes attached to that. And the governor is something where you can actually set your own governance mechanism. You can also set the Aave DAO or have a progressive governance towards, let's say, to the Aave DAO or whatever fits your use case. So it kind of, the new V4 architecture opens up the whole development space and just thinking of how to use the Aave as an architecture to whatever innovation you might have.
Um, yeah, this is, I'm still processing, so this is actually cool. The thing, I guess, what I'm trying to understand now is that the time difference between V3 and V4 was 3 years, and that's basically just a little bit longer than all the L2 stuff we've seen come up. And I'm kind of curious on like, how do you think about what a cross-chain world looks like with V4, and does the spoke model help solve that a little bit? Does that make things easier? Does that make things complicated? What kind of does the multi-chain universe look like with V4?
Yeah, when we launched the Aave V3, we actually launched it first on L2s because we were betting that all the liquidity will move to L2s, and obviously that didn't happen, right?
Good
but
times.
yeah, but the L2s do exist, and they do have a significant value proposition, specifically for transaction cost or customization. We saw recently the Robinhood chain announcement as well, where actually institutions are also and fintechs are also thinking about running their own infrastructure for their own use cases. In terms of Aave V4, we've always been agnostic to the EVM environment and want to be wherever the users are and serve a particular use case. And the way to do that, for example, is that with this same architecture, we can have, for example, liquidity hubs across different networks, and they can move actual liquidity between one hub to another from a network. So it actually creates a really efficient way to transfer liquidity between networks, and you can do it in a also way where you segregate risk. So you can give a allocation of liquidity from one network up to certain percentage. Let's say that hub number one on Ethereum gives only 20% cap to be transported to, let's say, to Base or Arbitrum, and this is based just the same architecture where you can actually allocate from one hub to another hub of a liquidity with the same network or cross-chain. And I think this is going to be a significantly interesting feature for anyone who is building any type of cross-chain functionality, cross-chain swaps, cross-chain lending, or fixed lending. There's a lot of opportunity there.
So I guess that's a very super unique feature, and it simplifies a lot of the common things that we see that end up adding bridge risk. And I think you can end up solving that a little bit because you're creating a line of credit now with a different chain on the same liquidity pool, which can also have its spoke model. So it's if I understood it right, this is like a pretty interesting creative outcome.
Yeah, and obviously you can do it in a different ways, that you can actually create almost like 3 credit lines to 3 different bridges, and kind of like limit the exposures towards that and diversify.
So it seems like you're kind of betting on this being a very common thing in the future. And kind of coming back to the DeFi 2.0 theme, I'm wondering, like, a few more years from now, how do you see DeFi evolve? This has been a pretty incredible year in terms of just stablecoins becoming more popular, DeFi getting more popular again. a little bit more regulatory clarity. Do you have any predictions for what the next few years look like?
Yeah, I think what's going to be really interesting is just using the existing architecture and infrastructure that we built in decentralized finance for native crypto assets and applying this um, to also traditional assets that are coming on chain, basically RWAs. And reason why this is interesting is that there's a lot of assets in traditional finance that are extremely liquid that could actually be brought on chain. And one way we are actually doing this is with the Horizon initiative that we have at Aave. So Horizon is a Aave market where you can use permissioned assets as a collateral. So for example, BlackRock's Biddle money market fund.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and the idea there is that you can borrow permissionless stable coins. So it's a hybrid market. And over the line, what we want to do down the line is that we're going to go higher on the risk curve and introducing assets beyond money market funds, for example, credits, and also adding assets that have more volatility. So ideally, it's a market where in the future you can borrow against money market funds, credit funds, private credit, and also ETFs, and more kind of like equities types of assets, as long as they have off-chain liquidity.
Because you kind of, in a way, offload compliance on the other end without actually making that a blocker, and seems like that's what you're betting on.
And the compliance happens actually in the asset issuer level. So if you are a customer of BlackRock, you can access the Biddle, then you can collateralize and actually borrow against. And I think what's going to be really interesting observation probably is that how actually a DeFi product like Aave can actually enhance the experience of collateralization that is actually happening now in traditional finance, offering better competitive parameters, and also adding more transparency and adding also more flexibility. So for example, today in traditional finance, you can't really access liquidity over weekends. And I think that's just such an outdated.
Or after 5 p.m. on any day.
Yeah, exactly. Or the next day. And that's too slow for arbitrage that exists in a shorter period of time.
Maybe the last thing to end this on is, let's go back to the developers here. V4 is extremely powerful. We just kind of learned all the cool things about it. Do you kind of have any ideas for what you would like to see from developers, or like what do you think is like a message we can send or ideas for them to actually really explore the edges of what's possible with V4?
Yeah, I would like to see actually innovation on the spoke level, and spoke is essentially a borrowing strategy. Borrowing strategy can actually be connected to any type of other DeFi use case. So it can be connected to a trading strategy or some sort of AMM product as well. And I think the innovation in this level is there's a lot that can actually be done. I would like to also see some more innovative ways of managing, for example, credit, using different types of assets as a collateral that maybe has been difficult to implement in the existing lending protocols. Might be, for example, RWA assets, some sort of NFTs as well, depending what they represent. We're actually launching.
Did you just casually mention that NFTs are possible to be a lending market, or?
No, actually, this makes it easier because.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because you can create
This is going to be extremely powerful.
Yeah, you can create a spoke that accepts a certain type of an NFT as a collateral and just plug it into a liquidity hub and get access to capital.
So the Uniswap LP positions would be in this category.
Exactly. And typically why Uniswap LP positions haven't been that successful is because they do have the chicken and egg problem. So someone needs to come and put the liquidity in and borrow, and it's very hard to get the scale here. But in this new architecture, you can create this type of a model and use case and then plug into the liquidity hubs. And I think that's really interesting. We're going to actually release a DevNet quite soon and publish the actual V4 code base. There's a lot of already documentation and content about how the architecture works and other additional features that we have in V4 that are extremely excited. But yeah, we'll be happy to help anyone that actually are thinking of building on V4.
That's awesome. Well, that was my last question, but I think before we end this thing, I just want to say and recognize that it's refreshing and amazing to see that you've been still pushing the boundaries with like what's possible with Aave and like traditionally and even in crypto you see people take less risks with changing things too much or adding too many things in terms of improving stuff. And the fact that every version is better even after you've gone bigger and bigger is to me absolutely incredible. So I want to thank you for pushing the DeFi ecosystem forward, and it's awesome to see what's possible with V4.
Thank you, and I'm also betting a lot on the developer community because as from Aave Labs we can innovate as much as we can, but I think it's up to you all actually to push the innovation and the space forward. So thank you so much.
It's going to be a good rest of the year. So
I think so.
thank you so much,
Thank
Stani.
you.